A massive explosion has torn through the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Lebanon's prime minister says his country is facing a catastrophe, and Beirut is in mourning.
It was a massive explosion.
Hello friends, it's Alpha Bunga Bunga. The date is Wednesday, the 12th of August. My name is Alex Hochuli, and this podcast is also George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe. George is away this week, so it's just Phil and myself today, plus our guest who will be calling up very shortly, and the producer of this episode is myself, Alex Hochuli. Right, with that out of the way, today's episode concerns Lebanon's incredibly profound and multi-layered crisis. By my reading, it's pretty much a state that's falling apart. Now, obviously there's the explosion and everyone will have seen the images of it and the aftermath that devastated so much of Beirut, which killed hundreds, it injured thousands and left something like 300,000 homeless. And you'll probably also have heard and read about the reasons that we know so far about the explosion itself. Something like 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate were stored in the port for over 6 years. Deadly cargo abandoned there by a Moldovan flagged ship, which is owned by a Russian resident in Cyprus en route from Georgia to Mozambique. That whole story of malfeasance in shipping, including so-called flags of convenience and unpaid crew and much else, is actually a story for another episode and is something that we might wish to discuss at another moment. But for now, we should note that that explosion also hit the grain silo, the main store of Lebanon's grain, and the port in a country where something like 80% of its food is imported and where, due to the economic crisis, food insecurity had already been rising. So I just want to set out, before we go any further and bring Phil in, the sort of compounding crises that are affecting Lebanon. So, I mean, you've got the history and, in fact, the current reality of foreign interference, sectarianism, and a stagnant political system which was built on allocating different bits of the state to warlords that came out of Lebanon civil wars in the 70s and 80s. You've got a hugely corrupt elite, waves of Syrian refugees, something like 1.5 million there now, which amounts to a staggering 30% of the population. And that's adding to the existing Palestinian refugees who have been there for decades. And then you've got this massive economic crisis, which is all sorts of economic crises bundled into one. It's a debt crisis, budgetary crisis, a currency crisis, and a financial crisis all piled into one. And of course, lest we forget, there's the pandemic and then this explosion. I mean, the images are absolutely shocking. I think it was equivalent to something like a 1 to 2 kiloton bomb, which I'm informed is equivalent to something like a small nuclear weapon. So, I mean, it's hard to even really grasp the sort of different layers all at once that are impacting upon Lebanon right now.
And I think there's so many indeed, so many of, like you say, layers to Lebanon's problems. It's easy to be overwhelmed just by the sheer scale of what's going on there. So I think it's worth stepping back just for a moment to draw out some of the wider resonance of the story too. I mean, as you said, Alex, what was so shocking about it, partly beyond the loss of life and the physical devastation, was the fact that, the enormity of the blast was captured so widely on mobile phone footage and shared on social media, and that all obviously made it all so much more real to everyone who saw it. Because I suppose everyone could imagine themselves filming it on the mobile phone. You're in the video yourself when you watch that kind of footage on your phone or your device. So, nonetheless, despite everything that has made it so palpable and intense to people all over the world, I think it also speaks to some wider global themes that we've been exploring on this podcast for some time. And the first, I suppose, is the degradation of public infrastructure and state capacity around the world over the last several decades through neoliberal grifts of various kinds. The second, I suppose, would be identity politics, or the spectre of identity politics, of which Lebanon's history of communal rivalry, division, sectarianism is a particularly intense example. And then that this also intersects with politics of corruption and anti-corruption. And anti-corruption is also being offered as a way to kind of cleanse and restore Lebanon's political system, and that Lebanon has been through these cycles of popular revolt in recent times, which have all failed, as we've seen with the blast. They've all failed to make significant headway in transforming Lebanon's political system and state structures.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm very excited to have this discussion and to speak to our guest today, despite the circumstances which have prompted us to do so. In fact, we've been discussing ourselves about doing an episode on Lebanon already since last year, since the October protests emerged, and we never really got round to it. Those protests, actually, it's interesting because they coincide with the sort of 30-year anniversary of the Taif Agreement of 1989, which was exactly what established the post-Civil War settlement in Lebanon, which, as I mentioned just a second ago, it institutionalized the sectarian arrangements that have riven Lebanon. But it also created this immobile political system which fuels corruption and impedes the development of any majoritarian, universalist, or class-based politics. And so, Phil mentioned there identity politics. And of course, we wouldn't want to read what's going on in Lebanon through the prism of what's happening in Western countries right now. They're different things, but at the same time, there is something more general happening there of a tussle, of a struggle between particularist and universalist politics, which hopefully we'll be able to draw out with our guest. We're going to call up in just a second. Let me just introduce her. She's Rima Majed. She's a sociology professor at the American University of Beirut and an activist. And as well as covering the current situation there, we hope she'll be able to guide us through Lebanon's recent history so we can understand how we got to where we are right now, and later go into a little bit more depth in the issues which Phil just mentioned. So let's call up Rima right now. Okay, hi Rima. Thank you so much for joining us. Delighted to have you with us to talk us through so many of these complex issues.
Thank you, Alex, for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have this discussion. So as a way of setting the scene for us, maybe you could tell us a little bit about where you were when the blast actually happened. And I'm aware you've just been telling us right before we started recording that you've told this story a number of times. But just as a way of setting the scene and getting us all collectively into the headspace of what it's been like as well in Beirut for the past week.
Yeah, so I was in Beirut when this happened, and of course, I mean, as I was just telling you, I survived, and I think my story is probably not as horrible as other stories. I live just across the street from the university, from the American University of Beirut, so in the district of Hamra, for those who know Beirut. I had just arrived to a cafe where I was meeting with my friends. We had just met, and I had just ordered my coffee that afternoon. Actually, we were meant to meet earlier, and that day, for some reason, we decided to reschedule until 6 p.m. The blast happened at 6:08. We were sitting when it happened, when the first explosion happened. And everyone thought it was an earthquake because we didn't hear anything. We just felt that the earth under our feet was shaking. But it took less than a minute. We were still debating whether it was an earthquake or an explosion when the second huge explosion happened. And I can't remember the details. We were sitting in a sidewalk cafe, so underneath a building. And all I remember is that glass from everywhere. I mean, the whole building windows fell on us. I was lucky enough, to survive. My friends around me were some of them very badly injured. The friend I had just met in the cafe was badly injured, and we had to take her to an emergency room quickly. But at that moment, we all thought that the explosion had happened exactly in our neighborhood. It was so strong. And I say this as someone who's lived through many explosions in Beirut. I was actually in the same place in 2005 when the Hariri assassination happened, and that was enormous. But what we've witnessed on Tuesday last week was way, the magnitude of it was unbelievable. So we thought it had happened exactly in our street. We couldn't get into any of the hospitals around. There are about 5 hospitals in that district. Most of them were either damaged or already at capacity minutes after the explosion. So we took a cab and thought that we would get away from the explosion scene and cross to the other side of the city. But as we were driving around, we started to realize that, every neighborhood we'd get to was equally, if not more badly hit. So we started to realize that this was something huge that had happened. And the scenes from Beirut now are at once really heartbreaking, but also very, very enraging. I mean, this is a city that, like the rest of the country, that was already transforming at a very fast rate in the past few months. An economic collapse, really a financial free fall, a revolution in October that was very quickly met with a counter revolution and a very heavy repression and closing down of spaces for opposition. And then the COVID pandemic that but the whole world is already dealing with as a massive crisis. In Lebanon, that was just part of the crisis. So we thought that we had seen it all until Tuesday, when we realized that there's no end to this hell somehow. This is a city where people were already tired. A lot of people had already lost their jobs. Many people were already unemployed. We had lost most of our purchasing power. We were starting to run out of basics in terms of food supplies, medical supplies, etc. Garbage piling everywhere around us, electricity cuts. So it was already an incredibly bad situation. And with this blast, things just became multiplied by a million. So what we've seen since the blast last week is a complete. Why do I say it's enraging? Because this is a crime against humanity. What happened is a crime that, regardless of who has ignited that initial fire, the whole ruling mafia in Lebanon. I don't even want to call them leaders or a political class, because they aren't. They are all responsible. Every single person who's been in power for the past 3 decades, so since the end of the Civil War, is somehow directly or indirectly implicated in what happened and is responsible. But beyond that, and this alone has created is enraging, and it has created the rage we're seeing on the streets today. But beyond that, there has been a complete absence of the state in the first few days and even week now after the blast. So what we've seen is civil society and individual initiatives to remove the rubble and the glass from the streets, clean the streets, help each other, initiatives where people were trying to find accommodation for each other, etc. So it's really enraging to see that there really is no state when it's needed, and there is a very strong state when it isn't needed, which is when we protest. We only see them there. The protest that took place after the blast, the biggest one was on Saturday, was met with incredibly high crackdown, a heavy crackdown that is really, we not only we've been bombed, but we've also been on Saturday. It was thousands of tear gas canisters around, a heavy repression that is also a continuation of this crime. On Thursday, so in 2 days, the parliament is meeting for a special session with only one item on their agenda. And you would think that after such a catastrophe, the item on the agenda would be that. But the only item is to announce a state of emergency, which would mean that the military would step up and that they would have more power. They would give the security apparatus more power to enforce and deepen its crackdown on society. And this makes us all feel that we are at a very, very dangerous turning point in our history. I mean, after this blast, we know that it's a turning point, and that things will never be the same again. But it's very scary to also see how this is also becoming an opportunity for the state to entrench the police state and an authoritarian regime.
So before we talk a bit more about what's happening with the protests and the response of the state, I thought one thing that has been left out of the reporting from Beirut, but I thought perhaps you could tell us a little bit about it, is the relationship of the capital to the rest of the country, and how dependent the Lebanese hinterland is on Beirut, how what's happened in Beirut will affect the rest of the country. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the main problems in terms of development in Lebanon is that it's all centralized in Beirut. And when we say, I mean, the port is really the lifeline of not just the city, but the country. This is the Beirut port is the port through which more than 70% of the imports arrive. We are a country that has almost no productive sector, so we really rely on imports for our survival. And with the port now being gone, it means that just survival has become an even bigger problem. It was already a problem because of the shortage of dollars, but now it's also we don't have the port anymore. But yeah, you're right to say that there is an uneven development in Lebanon. There is the center, Beirut, is really the heart of the economic activity, and this is why it is it's a big hit to the country in general. What happened? I mean, I don't want to to sound like the opportunistic leaders, but I hope that after this, that this would also be an opportunity for us in the future to think about a more balanced development in the country. We have a port in Tripoli, we have a port in Sidon in the south. They're not as big as the one in Beirut, but we need more development outside of the capital to be able to deal with the magnitude of the several crises we will have to deal with for the decades to come. This is not going to be solved anytime soon. This is going to take a very, very long time, because it's not only a matter of reconstruction. It's a city that has been destroyed at the time of its biggest financial collapse. So and the social implications are huge in terms of jobs, in terms of, but also in terms of education, in terms of schooling, housing, hospital, healthcare, and class relations. I mean, this has transformed and will continue to transform the Lebanese society for years to come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think you noted somewhere that, it's almost an irony that it was the port that was hit, which is Lebanon's main lifeline. But the home of Lebanon's ugliest death, you wrote. And I think that's, quite apposite. I wanted to briefly discuss now a little bit about the protesters, about the protests that have emerged since, and we'll go back to talking a little bit more about the protests in more depth later on. But just to give us to continue rounding out this initial picture, what are the protesters currently demanding? What is it? Is there a kind of coherence around a single demand? Is it for the accountability for the explosion, to clean out the whole political class? And are there any political organizations behind different factions of the protest, or is it kind of quite broad or inchoate, or what is the character of the protest right now?
Well, the demands are many, and it is broad. And there's always this question about why isn't there a ready alternative in Lebanon? And what if we have a political vacuum? Who's going to step up? The demands are many, and the protests are they are protests, and they're not a protest. So there many factions within it, many different opinions, etc. There's a range of demands from accountability to revenge, and what we've been hearing this past week is mainly revenge.
Right.
People have no trust, and I mean, even in an international investigation. I mean, this is a country that has paid more than $1 billion for an international investigation, the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri in 2005. The verdict for that assassination was supposed to be declared last week, and the explosion happened before. Now the verdict is going to be declared. They're saying next week on the 18th. But we have no trust. It took more than 15 years, and almost everyone knows what the verdict is going to be. So we don't trust the internal judiciary channels. We don't trust the international community. And this is why I think what we've been hearing is revenge. People are just want. I mean, yes, we want accountability, but we cannot conceive of a way to do that. And it's clear that people are saying we don't want anyone from that ruling mafia anymore. And unlike what we've been hearing in October, there were voices during the October uprising. They were not the majority, but they were there, that were demanding solutions that are technocratic, or there were even people are asking for an army takeover. Today, we're not hearing this. Today, there's been, the rage is much bigger than what it was. And I think at this point, protests are mainly expressing this rage against the political class as a whole. What has everyone feels that we cannot reconcile with what has happened. What this means in terms of how do we move forward? Can we unify? Who's is the street being co-opted? Yes, of course, and this is nothing new, and I think it's not peculiar to Lebanon. Every uprising or revolutionary movement comes with repression, co-optation, and we are already seeing people who were part of this mafia that was ruling, trying to co-opt, trying to position themselves in the opposition, and trying to reserve for themselves a seat on the negotiation table that is now clearly in the hands of the international community after the visit of the French president a day after the explosion and what is happening. But I also want to say something about, yes, it is unfortunate that the uprising doesn't have a clear, and coherent and like leadership that can propose an alternative. But I also want to say that given the material conditions here, it's almost impossible for that to emerge at this point.
Yeah.
I think it's very difficult, to ask for a movement that, because October was a social explosion. It's not a coup. It's not organized. It's not. So we've been trying to organize for the past 10 months. But we all know that, in Lebanon, as long as it's performative, you're welcome to mobilize. The minute it becomes a threat to the regime, we know very well that this is going to turn very, very violent and very bloody. And we've seen how this can happen. So I think, yes, it's very dangerous. We're not talking about, peaceful protest. We're no longer in that phase where this is even possible anymore. I think that, unfortunately, we are going into more violence, and we are really at the brink of, a war.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's understandable, given all that's happened. And maybe as a way to try to understand the development that you've just sketched out of this huge social explosion at the end of last year, and how that's led us to today, we should actually rewind. And so what I wondered if you could give us a sort of a potted history of Lebanon since the end of the civil war. So maybe we should start there, the end of the civil war and the Taif Agreement.
Okay, I'll try to do that. It's a huge task, but I'll try. So the war ended with the Taif Agreement, which is an agreement that put an end to the war and started the Second Republic of Lebanon based on a sectarian power sharing agreement. And this is an agreement that this is what we call a corporate consociational democracy. So it's a type of democracy where the different identity groups, sects in this case, are represented with a specific number of seats. So the parliament, the cabinet, and all first-rank positions in the state are divided along a sectarian quota. So the president of the republic is a Christian Maronite. The president, the prime minister is a Muslim Sunni, and the speaker of the house is a Muslim Shia. The executive powers are in the hands of the prime minister. So what has happened since the Taif agreement? It clearly reshuffled the powers of the different sectarian leaders. It's important to say here that this is an agreement that is presented as an agreement that represents the different components of society, whereas in reality it isn't the case. It's an agreement. So unlike quota systems where you create a quota system for minorities to be represented, this is a system that puts in place a quota to represent the majorities, not the minorities, to put it in a simple way. So after the civil war, we had a sectarian power sharing agreement. We had an amnesty law that has issued an amnesty for all crimes committed during the 15 years civil war, and we ushered in a new age of neoliberalism with the projects of reconstruction that came with the Prime Minister Rafi al-Hariri at that time, 1992. And that was coupled with what we call a sectarian tutelage. I mean, more accurately, a Syrian tutelage, or more accurately, a Syrian occupation. And the division back then was that the economy would be in the hands of this new class of politicians headed by Hariri, and security would be in the hands of the Syrian regime, with Hezbollah being the only faction in Lebanon that was allowed to keep its arms as a resistance movement.
When you said Rima about the post-Civil War economics under the Hariri government or Hariri's leadership, could you tell us a bit about Lebanese neoliberalism? What did it look like? What were its major features? How did Lebanon or Beirut change under those economic policies?
Yeah, so I mean, so after the civil war and with Hariri, the reconstruction projects began, and instead of that being a project that would be led by the state and would reinforce state institutions, it was mainly led by a private company, Solidaire. And there was a clear rolling back of the state, and a weakening of state institutions, and every single public schools became very, very weak, and it was mainly the private sector that took over. Same with hospitals. Same with every single sector in the economy that you can think about. This is not completely new to Lebanon. So I'm not trying to say that before the war, Lebanon was not already a liberal economy. We never really had a strong state. It was only for a few years before the civil war under Fuad Shahab that we had a sort of a welfare state with like social security was established then. But after the civil war, this was very badly hit. There was a clear decision to join the neoliberal world, and it was ushered in with the reconstruction project. This also meant that it played very well in the interest of the sectarian leaders, because with the weakening of state institutions, it was really the alternative non-state welfare institutions that filled that void. So, and this is how clientelism flourished. This is how patronage, sectarian patronage flourished. So every sectarian leader was using the spoils of the state in many cases, but also the private sector was completely dominated by that class of politicians slash businessmen and bankers, and in many cases.
Right.
So the state became very, very weak, and it became that. This is why I call it the sectarian mafia state that took over.
So let me just jump in, because it'd be nice to scan forward through the 90s up to 2005, because 2005 is an important pivotal moment in recent Lebanese history, as far as I understand it. There was the Hariri assassination, which you already mentioned, but a lot of things ensued from that. And you have a wider context of the Iraq War and the escalation of the kind of Shia-Sunni conflict across the region.
Yeah, I mean, there's just one important event to mention before 2005 is 2000, because this is the year of liberation of the south in Lebanon. So this is the year when the occupied territories of Lebanon were occupied by Israel. And this is when the question of Hezbollah and the arms of Hezbollah emerged as a problematic issue, right? So our land is no longer directly occupied. There's still a very small region, the Sheba farms, but we're not sure whether this is a Lebanese region or a Syrian region. But anyways, this is when conflicting opinions about Hezbollah started to emerge. Until 2005, as I said, Lebanon was under the tutelage of the Syrian regime. 2005, the assassination of Rafi al-Hariri, most probably by the Syrian regime, created an important turning point, created a massive mobilization that shifted the balance of power in the country, and that forced the Syrian army to withdraw from Lebanon, but created an internal polarization between what came to be known as the March 8th and the March 14th camp. The March 8th camp led by Hezbollah and being pro-Syrian regime. The March 14th camp being accusing the Syrians of being behind the assassination and being closer to the west and the Western camp. That created, again, as I'm saying, a polarization that kept on increasing, and that became more and more violent, with a series of assassinations between 2005 and 2007. July 2006, Israeli war on Lebanon that destroyed a big chunk of the infrastructure of the country. 2007, 2008, internal conflicts. In 2007, there was a conflict in the Nahr al-Bared Palestinian camp, clashes between Palestinian factions and the army. 2008, an internal mini civil war that was framed as a Sunni-Shia war. Again, as you say, this comes against the backdrop of the Iraq War and the sectarianization of the Sunni-Shia conflict in the region.
And there's a sort of shifting patterns of sectarian polarizations and alliances that are happening here, right? Because, I mean, as you already mentioned, the March 8th and the March 14th groupings shifted things around and made alliances maybe slightly different to what Lebanon had been previously used to, where conflict had often been Christian versus Muslim, to put it in the most basic terms.
Yes, well, this is...
Yeah, go on.
This is exactly why. I mean, this whole sectarian framing has to be used very carefully, and this is not to say that there isn't, that sectarianism does not exist. It does, of course, but what it means to say that it's Muslim Christian or Sunni Shia is very complex. It's not a straightforward. I mean, these boundaries are not straightforward and are not clear. And they keep moving and they keep shifting. And if one zooms in, you will find that there are Sunnis on the side of the Shia and vice versa. And then there's the Christians who are when I say the Christians, of course, I mean the Christian political parties. So the players are many, and the way this is being framed it has to be looked at carefully. But of course, there was an attempt to sectarianize. So this is clearly a conflict over power and interest. It's an intersection of geopolitics, but also of internal structural shifts within the Lebanese society and within the Lebanese political class that translated in those terms, and that was and sectarianization was one of the processes or one of the tools used to turn this around and to mobilize on both sides of the divide. But this all again it took
just what I was going to say, it's a wonderful historic sweep from the end of the Civil War. I wondered if you could just bring us up to the Syrian War.
Yes, I was about to say.
Oh, wonderful. And just maybe to tell us a bit about the 2015 protests as well.
Yes. So this all shifted again in 2000, after the start of the Arab uprisings in 2011. And 2012, with the huge, when the war started and when the revolution turned into a war in Syria, and there was a huge influx of refugees from Syria. So Lebanon has the highest rate of refugees per capita in the world. But that also translated internally in terms of new tension and new clashes in different regions, from Tripoli to Sidon. I won't go into the details of that, but it again, inflamed those already existing fault lines and entrenched them further. It took a violent turn. And in the midst of that, as in Iraq, it's a very similar timeline, if you want. So there is those sectarian geopolitical tensions, but in the middle of that, in 2015, and actually in both countries, there was an eruption of mass protest that had nothing to do with the geopolitical scene, and that was really about basic services. In Lebanon, it was about the garbage crisis, right? We literally were drowning under piles of garbage. So again, this was another turning point that created a shift within the civil society, and this was the first time the civil society became a bit more or decided to go for a more politicized role, although the slogans were very apolitical at that time. But some parts of the movement organized and run for municipal and parliamentary elections, and things had started to. And the term an opposition started to be formed since then. So what happened in October 2019 with the revolutionary explosion, the uprising that we've seen, is really a continuation of an accumulation of all of these struggles over the years. And also, it's an intersection of all these different layers of the conflict, be it the socioeconomic internally, but also the geopolitical, the regional, that created this kind of mobilization that is, and I call it a social explosion, because it's not a revolution that took the shape of a coup. It's really an explosion, as we've seen with other revolutions in the Arab world. And one of its main challenges today is how to organize and how to move forward, and whether it will be able to do that or not.
Right. Yeah. Before we discuss actually that social explosion in a little bit more depth, maybe we should turn to the economic factors, because that was an important backdrop already to the 2019 protests. So how did we get to where we are with Lebanon? Obviously, the country has been a long-standing financial center for the region. Why did that then start to unravel?
Yeah, so as I was saying before, part of this whole neoliberalization process was, relying heavily on the banking sector and the real estate sector, so on financial capitalism, with no real productive sectors to rely on. So there's no real economy, if you want. And that has been a bubble that was, growing and growing until it burst in 2019. But the signs of that burst had started before in 2016 when the financial engineering started by the central bank. So just context for those who are not very familiar with the economy of Lebanon.
Yeah.
After the civil war, most of the reconstruction was based on loans that were mainly internal loans that the state had taken from local banks. So the biggest chunk of our debt is an internal debt to the Lebanese banks. And it has been, so the banking sector was praised for many years. I mean, the governor of the central bank has been in place for 30 years, like many other politicians in Lebanon, and he's received many awards for the great job he's done. They pegged the dollars. They pegged the Lebanese lira to the dollar at 1,500 Lebanese pounds. And this was always presented as a success story, although I mean, what was behind that was a bubble that was inevitably going to burst. And so what happened in the past few years is that the dollar's reserve started to dry up for many reasons. Lebanon's economy or finance relies a lot on remittances from Lebanese who live abroad. And more than 13% of our GDP comes from remittances, and this had started to dwindle in the past years. The regional conflict, the drop in the oil price, etc. All of these are factors that have affected the dollar's reserve in Lebanon. And instead of trying to find real structural solutions for what was happening, the central bank decided to attract capital by offering unbelievably high interest rates. So banks in Lebanon were giving an interest rate that could arrive to 18% and 20% for just depositing your money there. So, and this does not encourage anyone to do any investment. If you can put your money in the bank and sit and take the interest rate, why would you invest, right? So they were attracting capital through those crazy interest rates, but that was again not sustainable. The bubble, was bound to burst, and it did in 2019. And it took the central bank more than, I think, 6 or 7 months to even recognize that there is a crisis. So they keep saying there isn't a crisis. But anyway, so this is partly why we got to where we are today. And the problem is that because we don't have any productive sectors that we can rely on, whether agriculture or industry, Lebanon depends heavily on goods that we import from abroad, and that requires dollars, and the reserve of dollars has dried up, and this is why there has already been shortage of fuel, so shortage of the electricity had always been a problem, but it became more severe, but also shortage of wheat, so bread, basic medical needs, etc. And this is why, and what we've been living in the past few months, what is very clearly seen in our everyday life, even for people who don't really understand how the economy works. There are goods that we can no longer find. There are medications that are no longer available simply because we cannot import them anymore, because we don't have the dollars. The money of depositors in the banks have been illegally stolen by the bank. So people don't have access to their own deposits in the banks anymore in dollars. So there's an illegal capital control, and instead of, I'm all for a capital control and a haircut in a situation like this, but instead of that capital control and haircut to be imposed on the rich and those who've accumulated that wealth over the years, people, the 1% that is that has the biggest capital in the country was allowed to smuggle their money out of the country. We know that $6 billion have left the country between October and November 2019, while the majority of the depositors, so everyone else, had no access to their money anymore. So whatever dollars were left in the banking sector were smuggled out of the country.
Right. So it was the capital controls imposed and other banking restrictions. I mean, that really bit into even just kind of small deposits held by the middle class, I suppose.
Yeah, so we're talking about, this is the retirement money of people who had just retired. This is all gone now. And this is why I'm saying that the social implications are huge. Whatever little savings you had, whether it's, $1,000 or $2,000, or whether it's someone who's just retired and has cashed $50,000, for example, and this is all they have left. This is gone now. This money does not exist anymore, and we have no access to it. So this is a real social catastrophe.
Yeah.
In a country where the state does not provide anything. So so there's no healthcare that is provided for free, and so it really put the society, in a situation where there's absolutely no social safety nets.
So, obviously this leads to the eruption in October, and this downward pressure on living standards is felt across the board, the poor, the working class, and the middle class. Where does the spark come from? What causes people to come out onto the streets again?
So the spark is, as I'm saying, it's a financial crisis that had already started months earlier, but that became really felt in our everyday life in October. The spark was the week when the revolution had started, was a week when we had huge fires in several regions in Lebanon, and we've all seen a complete incapacity of the state to deal with the fires. So and then there was the WhatsApp tax that was, if you want, the spark. Of course, it's not a WhatsApp revolution, but that was the spark that ignited this uprising. But since then, it only kept on getting worse every day, and the banks, the immediate response of the banks was that they closed for the first time in the history of the banking sector in Lebanon. Even during the civil war, they have never closed that for that long, and all the illegal control they've imposed on people. So there was that. But I think what really made this mass mobilization in October 2019 a revolution is that this was the first time we saw the mobilization of certain social classes and certain social groups that are usually the constituencies of the traditional sectarian political parties in the country. And this was a clear message that something was changing from below.
Interesting.
They managed, unfortunately, these parties managed, it took them some time, but by December, they managed to co-opt that again. And, they've deployed all types of rhetorics about this being, funded by embassies, etc. That this is, an American plot or whatever. All the usual conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
But it was clear at the beginning, and why it was dealt with from the political leaders as a revolution from day one is that those who initially mobilized are their own constituencies, and this is very different from 2015 when. Those who mobilized was mainly, I dare say us, the middle class activists. And this is why it was dangerous and threatening, because, they know that this was a clear sign that their own people were turning against them. And of course, when I say their own people, I don't mean that these are blind followers or whatever description is usually used in the media. And there are clear reasons for why people would follow. Again, we're talking about a complete absence of the state, right?
So just to clarify that,
this way.
Just to clarify something, you're saying that the kind of nucleus of the base of sectarian politics is the middle class. Is that right?
No, it's several classes. It's actually, I'm saying those who mobilized are not initially the middle class. This is the working class. The middle class is more the activist civil society scene.
So I just meant in the sense that because it came as a shock, that the protest signified something was changing because it was breaking the sectarian mold.
It was breaking the sectarian mold because this was somehow an alliance between the middle class and the working classes, or the middle classes and the working classes. So we don't usually see them mobilizing together, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a civil society that is neat and that has its own slogans that are, more focused on reform, accountability, etc. And you had these outbursts of mobilization, of anger from the working classes in different neighborhoods. But the scale of what happened in October was that it started with the working classes. And anyways, the tactics they used were clearly different than 2015. It was not peaceful mobilization. It started with burning of tires and blocking the main highways and roads in the country. And it was across the country. It started in Beirut, but spread very quickly across the country. So it's not like the peaceful scene of activists with banners. It was, it was burning. They actually even burned, garbage bins. So it was a different scene and it was a different message, but they were very quickly joined by the middle classes. Which created the mass mobilization we saw the next day in the squares, and then you have the politics of the squares and what happened then, and how the class dynamics in the squares have shifted in the first few days. And unfortunately, those who had initially mobilized and those who had really created this revolutionary moment retrieved later. And many of them return to their initial, basis.
Right. Yeah. So I think it'd be good now to turn to sectarianism specifically. And I mean, later on, we'll talk about the protests now and what the future looks like. But to try to understand what I guess is a feature of Lebanon that most people outside of it will know. I mean, they'll know that there's different groups based on, I suppose, religious or whatever identities. But I guess maybe what's less known is something that you've written about, which is that everyone complains about sectarianism. It's used as a reason for why Lebanon, quote unquote, doesn't work. And that this is something that is complained about both amongst the ruling class, and amongst the masses. So how does this dynamic work where sectarianism persists and reproduces itself?
So I mean, everyone said, if you ask anyone in Lebanon, they would tell you sectarianism is bad. But if you ask the politicians and maybe some of their followers, they will tell you it's bad, but it's necessary because it's a matter of survival. And there's this whole discourse about representation. And this is where the work of someone like Nancy Fraser becomes important. They deploy so much the rhetoric of representation. There's very little about redistribution, right? Because I think at the core of it, it is a politics of redistribution. It is about distributing the spoils of the state through sectarian leaders, and therefore there's this aspect that is very much overlooked in the analyses on sectarianism. Of course, there is ideology, there's identity, interpellation, all of that, but there's also a political economy for how this works, and it's a structure, it's a system that is it's a bit like patriarchy. We complain about it, but it's there, right? And sectarianism is somehow the same. And this is why my recent work now is trying to theorize for what I call sectarian capitalism, thinking along other people who've written about racial capitalism. It's along these same lines of, this is identity politics that only feeds into capital accumulation and the engine of capitalism.
Now that's really interesting, because it's not just identity politics, as I guess many people in the West will know it, as a kind of discursive phenomenon about kind of subcultural groups interpreting their understanding, but it's really about power in the state and about distribution, about distributing parts of the state and allocating parts of the state along group lines. Exactly.
I mean, this is why I was saying it's a kind of identity politics, or when I mentioned the quotas, that is in favor of the stronger, not the weaker, the majority, not the minority, right? So it's a reverse type of thinking about identity politics or quota systems, etc. It is a system that is very in Lebanon. It's actually, a system that has existed. It's the system on which Lebanon was created to begin with. It's, this is a system that colonial powers have put in place 100 years ago. On September 1st, Lebanon will turn 100 years old, and this is a system that is as old as Lebanon. So I say it's a system, but it's a system that has also created its culture, right? And that has also shaped social dynamics and social relationships, and the shape of the state and political relations.
And it's not not a primordial relationship, right? I mean, you say it's 100 years old, but it's not as if these are some ancient identities that people. Yeah, it's something that is politicized and reproduced.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's good to clarify. These identities are not old, actually. It's a system that is old. And it's a system, I'm saying old, meaning it was created in the 19th century under the Ottoman Empire, and then further entrenched with the French and British colonial rule in the region. It has nothing to do with identities or religion or old religious feuds. Because if this was the case, we cannot really explain why it wasn't there before the 19th century, right? So no, it is a modern phenomenon. It actually, many historians have very clearly and beautifully explained how this is a system that came about with modernity. It is the outcome of modernity, and actually with the penetration of capitalism to the Middle East. So and this is again why I'm saying it's we need to start thinking about sectarian capitalism specifically as a type of capitalism in this part of the world where identities were used and the benefit of capital. So definitely no primordialism there, and it has shifted many times. And just very quickly in Lebanon, if we just look at the past 100 years in Lebanon, the main conflict started as a conflict between the Druze and the Maronites. It then shifted to a conflict between the Maronites and the Sunnis, and then it became a conflict between the Christians and the Muslims. And then after 2005, it shifted to Sunni Shia. So there's nothing fixed or old or primordial about it. This is very much about political fault lines.
Yeah, and I mean, you've spoken about sectarianism from above as well as sectarianism from below. So it might be interesting to give a picture of what the daily experience of this sectarian division in politics is actually like, because obviously people fit into these groups or cast into these groups, and they pursue their interests through them. So I think there's separate judicial systems in Lebanon. So you have to appeal through, maybe you could explain how that system works rather than me trying to explain it.
So there is. So you're right to say that in Lebanon there isn't for personal status law. So everything related to family law, marriage, divorce, inheritance, custody, etc., property. This is all dealt with through religious courts. There are 15 religious courts in Lebanon, so we don't have a civil code. So, and this is why I don't think that we can speak of citizens in Lebanon. We don't have one law for all citizens.
Right.
So, so there's no civil marriage in Lebanon. If you want to marry someone from another religion or another sect, you'll have to travel to Cyprus in most of the cases. So, and this is how it shapes society, right? Even family relationships are shaped by that. Property is shaped by these different courts and these different laws. But I say sectarianism from below because there's also, an oversimplification when we say that, yes, it's leaders who are benefiting from sectarianism, of course. But there's a question that remain to be answered: is why do people follow? It's not just that it's not that people are just blind followers and the leader tells them, okay, so today you have to hate the Sunnis, and they wake up and they all hate the Sunnis. Yeah. This is not how it happens, right? There are, and this is why these are very complex processes at the social level that have also created mechanisms of sectarianism from below, where people start to see their existence through these different parastate institutions and channels, but we're also, because of clientelism, because it's very difficult to get a job in Lebanon if you don't have a push from a certain leader somewhere. It's very difficult to get into to get free schooling or medical or healthcare if you don't have that backing. So in our everyday life, people depend very much on those leaders who fill the void of the state by providing those services in return of loyalty, right? And people are when you don't see a state, you are afraid to let go of that whatever benefit you think. And in many cases, it's really as Berlin would call it, it's cruel optimism. In many cases, people are not getting anything, but it's just the belief that in case they need it, there would be someone who would have their backs. And so that someone would be their sectarian leader.
Right. So that ties sectarian elites together with the masses, with their bases, into this.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, but there's also another very important aspect of clientelism that is not about material interest and that is not about jobs and access to services, but that is about safety and security. And I think this is one of the strongest pillars of this system, that, again, because the state does not protect its citizens, and as I said, we're not citizens, safety becomes very much a matter of, these tactics. And part of what happened, part of what has been happening for years now, for decades, is that these parties are very strong at the neighborhood levels, and this is why I say they're mafias. And if you dare be vocal against them, you are really threatened in your in your own home. And we know stories, and our family members, our friends, all of us, of people who've been threatened by those around them because they participated in protests, people who've been beaten up, people who've been and those parties are also in control of the judicial system. So there are people who've been thrown in jail with allegations such as, they are a drug dealer or whatever. So they can fabricate those allegations, and they can literally throw you in jail for years. So I'm saying that just to say this is a very strong system. Lebanon is never thought of as an authoritarian system, but when we zoom in and we look at how the state is functioning, it is actually an authoritarian system that has a facade that looks like liberty and democracy, and people can protest and people can write and people. But this doesn't come without consequence, depending on who you are and how much you threaten this regime. And as people are becoming more and more vocal, threat is bigger. And this is why I think we are going into a more violent episode.
So, I mean, in general, and maybe looking at the scenario before the most recent events, was there any agency or group pushing hard against sectarianism? Not just obviously in the name of, in a kind of masking of their own interests, saying that they're against sectarianism, but really just wanting to advance their own group interests. But is there any kind of group in society, agency, which was really genuinely against the consociational system?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there are many groups. And actually in 2011, when the Arab uprisings started in the region, in Lebanon, there was a movement that, used the same slogan, but tweaked it to the Lebanese case. And it was "the people want the downfall of the sectarian regime." So not just the regime. And there were many movements. There's the civil society movement for years has been anti-sectarian. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, the left was very strong in Lebanon, and all leftist parties were against sectarianism. One thing that at that point was, I think, a slippery slope was that sectarianism. We always think of anti-sectarianism in terms of nationalism, right?
Yeah.
And we have still seen this in the recent protests when people hold the Lebanese flag. And they talk about unity and coexistence. What they mean is that we are not sectarian. But the very idea of sectarianism is the other side of the coin of nationalism.
Yeah,
right.
It's a different form of ruling class unity, I guess.
Exactly. And I think this is a trap that we have repeatedly fell in, in the history of Lebanon, that the only way we can imagine an anti-sectarian movement is by adopting a nationalist rhetoric that is either a Lebanese nationalism or an Arab nationalism. In both cases, it's not a very different, in the broader scheme of things, it's not a very different system than a sectarian system.
So on this point of this kind of dialectic between universalism and particularism in Lebanese politics, I suppose I wanted to take you back a bit to, you mentioned earlier how Lebanon has followed in the groove of the regional protest politics that have swept through countries like Iraq, Egypt and Syria since the Arab Spring, and that they've all failed. And that Lebanon has seen that kind of the failure of this popular protest politics as well. And I wonder, I suppose, if you could tell us whether or not there's a feeling of any lessons learned by the left in the region. Is there any kind of experience that has settled or insight that has come from the failure of popular protest politics and the collapse into civil war and sectarianism that we've seen since the failure of all the revolutions launched by the Arab Spring?
Yeah, I'm a bit wary of describing what is happening or what has happened as a failure. I think, yes, clearly there is a counter-revolution that in many cases has turned these uprisings into horrible civil wars or transitional or a political transition that led to dictatorship, as in Egypt. And but I think revolutions are we need to look at them in the long durée, and I think this is a process that has started in 2011, but that will keep on unfolding for decades to come. I also think that there are two countries in the region that managed to have not an ideal transition, but I wouldn't necessarily qualify them as a failure. And that is Tunisia. And I mean, the first wave of Arab uprisings, Tunisia was the best case scenario. The second wave of Arab uprisings, we have Sudan. In both countries, what was different from the rest of the countries that have witnessed uprisings is the presence of unions. And in Tunisia, it was the UGTT that played an important role. And these are, because unions play an important role with, they have a social presence beyond just the political presence. But because these are conflicts that are, these are revolutions that exploded because of inequality, because of this is the region in the world that has the highest rate of youth unemployment. So unions can play a very important role. And in Sudan, it was the Sudanese Professionals Association. And I think this is a lesson learned. And there were attempts, and still are attempts in Lebanon at organizing along those lines. I'm part of that kind of organizing. It's very difficult. I don't know if I can already say we failed, but there are many internal divisions. There are many, challenges in doing that. But I think this is a very, very essential lesson for the left, and for anyone, even if they're not necessarily leftist. But I think anyone who really wants a transition needs to look at this not just as a political problem, but also as a deeply economic one. And we're talking about societies. I mean, if we had union, I mean, in the past few months in Lebanon with the economic crisis, we have massive layoffs. Where are the unions? Who protects the workers? Who protects the employees? Who protects? So, and there was, in the history of Lebanon, is a very clear, I mean, when you asked me about what it means when we say the neoliberalization after the civil war, I should have mentioned that before. And with the Hariri governments and what came after that, one of the first things they did was to dismantle the labor union and the labor movement in Lebanon, and they did it in a very violent way. that they completely dismantled it and co-opted it. I think the General Federation of Workers in Lebanon is probably one of the very few in the world that has voted against raising the minimum wage. So imagine what kind of unions we're talking about, completely co-opted by the regime.
Right.
So I think this is an important lesson. And I think that moving forward, this is definitely something that we need to, to keep in mind and to organize along those lines. But at the same time, I think in Lebanon now, we've been saying this for the past 10 months, and we've been trying to organize along those lines. And as a university professor, I've been organizing with other university professors and trying to create a union because we don't have a union for university professors in Lebanon. But I think where we are now after this explosion requires a different type of, of course, organizing a labor movement is a longer term goal, but we are really at the brink of an even bigger collapse today. And I just wish we had left that was organized enough to step up, but unfortunately we don't.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, it does seem like what was kind of proto-revolutionary situation right there. But maybe, the kind of organization isn't there to take that forward. And I want to discuss that in just a second. But before that, as a means of rounding this out and bringing us back to the current day, and to discuss the crisis, what is the situation now in Lebanon with regard to the questions of foreign assistance and or intervention? I imagine there's been some sort of middle class constituencies which have been hoping that the kind of international community comes and saves Lebanon and whatever. And no doubt you're skeptical of things like that. But how do you see that game playing out? You mentioned right early on that Macron arrived there the day after the explosion. Wouldn't it be lovely if we all had the confidence of an Emmanuel Macron to walk through the streets of a foreign country saying, "I'm here to save you"?
Yeah, I mean, the very same Emmanuel Macron actually is the one who gives the Lebanese state the thousands of tear gas canisters that they were throwing on us on Saturday. I mean, it's the French state that donates that to the Lebanese state.
When they're not using it on French citizens themselves.
Exactly. I mean, the same Emmanuel Macron that has horribly dealt with the Yellow Vest mobilization. So I don't know what kind of hope we can have and we can have there. But if you could tell us, Rima, how real is that constituency for? Because it was widely reported, widely shared on social media, the apparent popularity of Macron, the hope that the French could. Force some kind of new pact or agreement among Lebanon's various political groupings. There was a petition that was widely shared on the internet as well, which had tens of thousands of signatures of people who wanted to see the restoration of the French mandate. How real is that? This is really the irony of history. Where we are today in terms of the political makeup of this country and also its economic makeup is really the result. Partly, of course, not completely, but partly a result of French colonialism. So thinking today that this is going to solve it, and it's, I understand, and I don't mean to undermine the reality of people's feeling. People are it's despair, right? People feel the emotions at the first few. Even today after the explosion, we were literally blown up. So I understand that people want any kind of savior, and that what I'm going to say is probably not very popular outside activist circles, and I totally understand that people want to believe that someone is going to save us. But it's also important to say that it's very unlikely that we are going to be saved by the international community. And I say this not to say that we shouldn't have recourse at all to the international community. It depends on whom in the international community and who here is negotiating and how this is happening. Unfortunately, we are not in a situation where, and internally we are able to shift. But there is a party in the country, Hezbollah, that has an army with with weapons. So we are not in a situation where we can talk about a liberation front that is able to do that alone. Yes, if we can pressure the international community, maybe we should do it. But that definitely is not in the form of Macron coming to Lebanon and giving the meeting with all the next day after the explosion. He sat with the very same criminals who blew us up a day before. He sat with all of them, and he called for a national unity government, which for Lebanese is a very clear term that means more of the same. This is not about a change in the system in Lebanon. This is actually about reproducing and entrenching even more this consociational system. And this is why I think, and talks about early elections and talks about, to me, it really sounds like someone has really to be hallucinating to believe in all of that. We cannot talk about Lebanon as a democracy with institutions that function. It's not a coincidence that every election, it's the same leaders who get voted in again. There is a structural reason for why this happens. In the absence of a state, people are going to vote every time, although they know, and they curse them every day, but they know that they have no alternative in terms of just basic survival than those leaders. But also, we cannot talk about a transition, a term that the West is using a lot. There's no transition in Lebanon before banning those every leader that has been, or every person that has been in power after the civil war in Lebanon needs to be banned from public life in Lebanon. And all these parties that have participated in the civil war and in the different governments that followed have to be dissolved. The amnesty law is the main reason. We cannot. It's the same warlords, war criminals that they just changed they dressed in suits and became the politicians. These are the president and the speaker of that. These are all war criminals. So this is the time for justice.
So you've indicated your skepticism of Macron and the point about how so-called national unity governments will just entrench the very problems that Lebanon has to escape. And in a piece you wrote for CNN, you said, quote, the international community needs to immediately freeze all the accounts and properties of the Lebanese oligarchs, end quote. But I was wondering, doesn't that risk kind of inviting a softer version of that Macronite, or a kind of giving an opportunity for some kind of nation building in Lebanon, wouldn't that be terribly risky to invite the international community and to kind of destroy the authority of the Lebanese elite, but perhaps at the expense of the Lebanese people?
But this is exactly what I was saying. It's a catch-22. But at this point, I'm very much aware of all the imperial implications of this, but it's not like we have other choices. I wish we had, and I definitely wouldn't want that to happen. But today we know that our economic crisis is also, it's part of this broader system. And I'm not under the illusion that the international community will save us. But I'm saying if we can pressure and use our leverage here and there to salvage a bit of what we can salvage, then I'm not personally opposed to that. And this is definitely not an invitation for any imperial power, to come here and decide. But just the context is that this is a country where you have several empires that are already here and that are already meddling in in what is happening. And this explosion is probably not an accident. It's part of that broader scene. So I'm careful in saying this, but I also think that pressure means that we need, the same way. I don't know about the politics of our listeners today, but I personally believe that Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal, right? And I think that pressuring these regimes is important, not because we believe in the West, but because this is one of the tools that we can maybe use, and this is not just in the West. This is everywhere. I mean, one important actor today that no one is really talking about seriously is Russia. Where are the Russians from this explosion in Lebanon? And why do we not hear about their role? They were amongst the first to arrive to the Lebanese port. The ship that brought the 2,750 tons of nitrate is a Russian ship. It arrived in 2013, just a few months after the chemical attack in Syria. I'm not trying to say that these are necessarily linked, but I think after 2013, we cannot talk about geopolitics in this part of the Middle East without accounting for all the different players, and Russia is one of them. So today we are dealing with all these different types of imperial powers, whether regional or global, and unfortunately, I wish we could have, as I said, and I've been calling for a national liberation front to be formed, but I also know that the possibilities of that, and with the complexity of the situation in the region, it's difficult to say that no one will interfere. Everyone is interfering, and it's unfortunate, but this is what it is.
Yeah, so I think finally turning to something which touches very directly on that question of foreign interference and the international community and its attempt to provide tutelage to different countries, including Lebanon, is the question of the Hariri verdict, which is due, I think you said, on the 18th of August. You said everyone already expects what the verdict will be, but do you think the announcement will sway things in any way? Will that be another element which might shift dynamics within Lebanon and also in relation to Syria and so on?
Yeah. Yes, I think it will, and I think again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I don't want to. But the timing of the explosion is also. There's a question mark there, and what we've been hearing here is that the coming days are going to be very dangerous. Everyone is saying that this weekend is going to witness another big event. And yes, I think this verdict, although probably we know what it's going to be, but it will be used politically. And now the negotiation table is there, and everyone is sitting around it, and they will use every bit of whatever they have to push to one side or the other. So I think this will definitely be used in whatever is being cooked for this country, but really this region. And we cannot think about the politics in Lebanon detached from Syria. Lebanon has two borders only: an enemy state, the occupied Palestine by Israel on our southern borders, and Syria on all our other borders. So we cannot really think, and then the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and our access to that sea through the port that no longer exists. So geopolitically, we are really, trapped. So it's impossible to think about any development in Lebanon without accounting for Syria and for Israel and all the players in both countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we should leave that here. I did want to ask you of how you see things unfolding in the next couple of days and months, but I think there's so many moving pieces that all, I guess we can say is that we wish you all the best in trying to overturn and hold accountable the ruling class, which has led Lebanon into the situation it's in right now.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not optimistic for the coming weeks or months. I think a war is unfortunately very probable. It will either be a war or a deal that is going to reproduce the same rulers with a redistribution of power that they will negotiate. In both cases, this is going to be detrimental for the Lebanese population, and for not just the Lebanese but all residents of this country, whether it's Syrian refugees, the Palestinian refugees, but also, the hundreds of thousands of Asian domestic workers who live in this country. This will have implications on everyone. And,
Well, let's hope it's neither a stitch up nor a war, and maybe hopefully a revolution instead. Rima, thank you very much for joining us and taking the time to talk to us.
There's probably more to be said about this. I mean, it's a very difficult question regarding the international community. And especially when we talk about the international community, we tend to always think about states necessarily. But there's also, international solidarity that can come from not just the states, but people and comrades and other organizations abroad that can, help in terms of solidarity, but also in terms of pressuring their governments and some when needed. And I think this is very important. So I think meeting with embassies is a clear no line for me, and I would never do it. And although since October, many of us have been invited by embassies repeatedly, but a lot of us have refused. But I think this is one type of, and this is clearly imperial intervention, right? But there's something else, which is things like what we're doing now, and it's creating those networks, beyond the borders, where we talk to each other, where people abroad can put pressure, can help in different ways that are not just charity, not just sending donations, but also political.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would be good if you wanted to tell us any way that listeners could help, charitably or beyond that, politically as well. That would be helpful, and we'll include any links as well in the show notes.
Yeah, I can send a few links, but I'm thinking more in terms of when I speak about freezing the assets of the oligarchs. Just last week we discovered that one of the main bankers in Lebanon has bought a flat in New York for $10 million at a time when we don't have access to any dollar from the very same bank. So it's through those networks and through solidarity that we talked with comrades in New York, and they mobilized there, and now they're trying to we're trying to take a legal road against that. I'm not saying that it's not about believing in the legal system or believing that this will change the world, but things like that can be useful at this point. The level of misery is unconceivable, and at this point we need to do those things. We don't have alternatives, right? Unless we turn into an armed resistance movement.